You know, in geopolitics, sometimes the biggest story is the one that doesn't happen. Today, we're digging into exactly that, a massive military strike that looked absolutely certain, only to be pulled back right at the last minute.
So, picture this. The tension was just thick. You could feel it. The headlines were screaming, military forces were moving into place, and the political talk was getting hotter and hotter. Seriously, the entire world was basically holding its breath, just waiting for the news that the first missile had been fired.
And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? When every single sign was pointing towards war, why did the whole thing just stop? Well, according to the source material we're looking at, the answer isn't as simple as someone just changing their mind. It's way more complicated than that.
Okay, so to really get why this last-minute reversal was such a shock, you have to understand just how close things actually got. I mean, the preparations that were made weren't quiet or subtle at all. They were loud, clear signals that something big was about to go down.
Let's just run through the checklist here, because it's pretty stunning. You've got a U.S. carrier strike group sitting right there in the Persian Gulf. A brand new combined air defense system goes live in Qatar. Key American officials are pulled out of forward bases. Then, Iran closes its entire airspace. Both the U.S. and Israel put out statements saying they are fully prepared, and Iran makes it crystal clear they will retaliate hard. At that point, the analysis from the source concluded the chance of an attack wasn't 50-50, it wasn't 90%, it was 100%.
So the stage was perfectly set for this huge, region-altering conflict, and then the curtain just never went up. So let's get into that critical moment, that decision, and the one key part of the strategy that, according to the source, just wasn't ready to go.
So the brakes got slammed on at the very highest level. This analysis, which points to reports from Israeli and New York Times sources, says it all came down to a direct conversation between the Israeli government and the U.S. president. But look at that word, deferred. That doesn't mean canceled. So the real question becomes, what were they waiting for?
And this is where we get to the absolute heart of the explanation. It's a concept the source calls the killer setup. The argument is that this was never going to be just an air war, just dropping bombs from the sky. The plan supposedly required a whole network of agents on the ground ready to move in sync with the air attack to make sure the government would collapse, and collapse fast. But according to this analysis, that ground network, that killer setup, well, it just wasn't in place yet.
And this whole idea of a network on the ground, it wasn't just some one-off tactic they came up with. The source actually frames it as just one piece of a much larger, almost standardized playbook for how to pull off a regime change.
According to this analysis, it's like a well-known four-step process. Step 1, you hit the economy with crippling sanctions to make people unhappy. Step 2, you start pushing out propaganda to control the story. Step 3, you start feeding aid, technology, and even weapons to protest groups inside the country. And then finally, Step 4, once the country is weak enough, that's when you launch the big attack.
So, what was the endgame here? According to the source, the goal wasn't to install some new, shiny, unified government. Oh no. The claim is that the objective was to actually break the country into smaller pieces, creating a Syrian-style mess of competing factions. Why? Because these little fractured groups would then completely depend on outside powers to survive, which makes the whole region a lot easier to influence and control.
Okay, but this just begs a huge question, right? What's the real reason for all this pressure? The source we're looking at argues that the reasons you hear on the news, well, they might not be the whole story. And here's where the source draws a really sharp line. The official story you'll hear is all about human rights, crackdowns on protests, and dictatorship. But this analysis claims the things that are really driving this are all about geopolitics and money. Things like Iran's refusal to just fall in line, its challenge to Israel's power in the region, its growing nuclear and missile programs, and of course, the massive prize of its oil and gas reserves. And to back this idea up, the source says, hey, just look at the history. It points to the CIA-backed Operation Ajax in 1953 to get control of oil, then U.S. support for the Shah's brutal regime in the 70s, and then support for Saddam Hussein when he went to war with Iran in the 80s. The argument here is that what's happening now isn't new. It's just the latest chapter in a very, very long book.
So when you boil it all down, this analysis claims it all comes down to these three demands. The argument is that if Iran just gave in on these 3 points, stopped challenging Israel, shut down its nuclear ambitions, and gave up some control of its oil, all that talk about human rights and democracy would just kind of fade away.
But this kind of intense pressure doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It actually causes a reaction.
And in response to all this, the source says we're seeing a new countermove start to take shape, a new defensive alliance forming right in the region.
This slide really breaks down how this new team would supposedly work together. You've got Pakistan bringing its weapons manufacturing and military know-how to the table, you've got Saudi Arabia providing the all-important money and investment, and then you have Turkey chipping in with its really advanced drone technology and other modern weapons. The whole idea is to create a new power bloc, one that can push back against the old order.
And wow, this quote from the source really just puts it all into perspective, doesn't it? The logic here is basically survival. In what's described as today's great chaos, the feeling is that smaller countries have to band together to protect themselves, or they're going to get picked apart by the bigger, more powerful groups.
Which brings us to a final, really important thought that comes out of this analysis. The source is clearly deeply skeptical that you can force regime change from the outside. It argues that history shows these kinds of interventions just end up weakening countries instead of actually building democracies. And that leaves us with a pretty critical question to think about. Can one nation ever really deliver democracy to another through the barrel of a gun?